I've worked as a correctional officer for a long time. I've worked at facilities in Texas and in Michigan. The oldest prison I've ever worked at just recently started to close in Michigan, and it got me thinking about all the paranormal experiences I've had there and in the other prisons I've worked at. I'd like to share with all of you some of the more notable paranormal experiences that I've had while working in these prisons. First off, I'd like to say that I never really believed in ghosts before I started working as a correctional officer. I started off working in Texas at an intake facility. I worked night shifts 12 hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. The first experience that I ever had was working on a lower security housing unit. When finishing a round, I was chatting with my partner and I heard a loud banging sound. It was at like 3 a.m. at this point. No prisoners should be out of their bunks. I asked my partner if they knew what the banging was. They, being an older officer, told me bluntly that the unit we were working was haunted. They told me the sound was coming from a door of one of small, quiet cells in a hallway not directly visible from the officer station, and about how a prisoner had died in one. The prisoner allegedly died because the officers working there at the time had given them a sack of food when it was lunchtime for prisoners, and the prisoner had choked on the food and died. I really didn't believe that the unit was haunted, so I decided to go look at this door. The sound volume increased as I got closer to the door. The door itself was visibly shaking as if someone was pounding on it. There was nothing that could have been causing the door to shake like it was. I was at a loss for words. Later that night, I checked the door again, and there was a steamed-up handprint visible on the glass of the door's window. Another experience I had was at the same facility, but at a different housing unit. It was around 1 to 2 a.m., and I was sitting inside the officer station, watching the cameras and talking to my partner. I look at one of the cameras and clearly see a prisoner sitting at a table in the day room. I turn my head to look at the day room, and no one is sitting at the table I just saw on camera. I ask my partner to go check it out, because no one is supposed to be out of bed yet. I roll back the time on the camera to see if I could see where the prisoner might have gone. The prisoner on the camera literally slowly fades away and vanishes completely. My partner comes back into the officer station, and we both watch this video over and over. Later on that same night, during one of my rounds, I notice a wet floor sign that got left out. I return it to the porter closet. I get back to the officer station and look back to where the porter closet is and see the same wet floor sign left out. I ask my partner if they are playing a joke on me or something because I just put the sign away. Partner denies doing anything with it. I go back out and make sure I put the sign back in the closet and lock the door. Get back the officer station, wet floor sign right there in the open again. My partner and I are both watching this wet floor sign now. It starts to tip over on one end very slowly, 2 of its legs off the ground. The sign then slams itself to the ground. It then proceeded to slide quickly up the hallway and then back to in front of the closet door before ceasing all movement. My partner and I refused to come out of the officer's station for the rest of the night because we were scared shitless. One more notable one from Texas. I was working in an ad-seg unit, really high security unit for prisoners that get in fights and cause a lot of problems repeatedly. We had a prisoner who was sitting in one of our close observation cells. These cells are usually used for people who threaten harming themselves. In the summertime, prisoners will sometimes just say they are suicidal to be put in one of these cells because they are a lot cooler and are near AC vents that the normal housing units don't have. The prisoner told me that this was what they were doing and that they didn't want to cause any problems. Later on that night, one of my partners and I were watching cameras, and all of a sudden we see a shadow moving across the floor. Eventually it comes to the closed observation cell and disappears under the door. This is where it gets a little crazy. I do a round and check on the close observation cell. The prisoner is pacing in the cell. I ask the prisoner if they are okay, and the prisoner tells me that something doesn't feel right and that they are hearing voices that aren't there. I try to calm them down, and eventually they do, and lay on the bed. Later on, my partner calls for assistance because the prisoner had bit in the skin of their own wrists, causing them to bleed, held them above their head, and allegedly was speaking in tongues. When I started working at prisons in Michigan, I worked at a prison that's now closing. It was built back in 1877 and is one of the oldest prisons still operating in all of the United States. There were so many small experiences that I've had here. Doors would slam, you'd hear voices, cold chills. The first really notable experience I had was around Christmas time on third shift. I was working the oldest unit on the facility. Usually we don't have prisoners there, but we had opened the unit to separate prisoners during the COVID pandemic. I didn't have a partner due to how short-staffed we were, so one of the other officers set up a TV for me to keep me entertained because I'd be really far away from all the other units and get bored with no one to talk to. I do rounds for most of the night watching TV in between them. You suddenly hear a banging noise from a door that leads to a hallway that takes you all the way to an even older, unused, condemned part of the prison. I open the door and take a look down the hallway. A cold breeze hits me, and suddenly my arm hairs stand on end. I close the door, thoroughly creeped out. I go and sit down and start watching TV again. The TV starts flipping through channels rapidly and then stops on static. I have to get moved to a different unit because I'm scared shitless. One day on third shift, my work friend and I were working positions that allowed us to have a lot of free time and no prisoners to watch. We decided to explore the prison. We explored the tunnels that went underneath the prison, the old barns, the old unstaffed gun towers. We eventually decided to go look at the old condemned part of the prison from my earlier experience. There was a big metal gate that was about halfway down the hallway that had to be opened by a big skeleton key. We get back to the old condemned part, and my friend tells me about how this part was supposed to be the old segregation. We had to use flashlights to see because this section is so old it's not powered. The energy back there I won't ever forget. Just being there filled me with a feeling of dread. I ask my friend to head back, and we start to head back down to where the hallway to the gate was. My friend's flashlight suddenly dies. We make it to the hallway, barely able to see anything in the almost pitch blackness. We hear something running after us, so we start running up the hallway too. My friend fumbles with the key as we hear it getting closer. We get the gate open and sprint out of there. Later on, I noticed that my friend had red claw marks all over his arms. Back in 2019, I worked intake at a county jail in North Carolina. Night shift mostly dealt with DUI arrests, domestic disputes, drug charges, probation violations. Nothing too exciting most nights. Around 3 a.m. one night, deputies brought in this guy named Dennis after a traffic stop. Mid-40s, skinny, buzzed gray hair, wearing an old hunting jacket. The deputies joked around at first because they'd found zip ties, duct tape, knives, and a stolen handgun in his truck. One of them said, "Either this guy hunts deer or people." Dennis didn't react at all. That was the first thing that felt off. Most people getting booked are angry, nervous, drunk, whatever. This guy just looked tired. I started processing him like normal, fingerprints, paperwork, inventory. Then I asked if he had any scars or tattoos. He said, "Scar on my stomach from where she stabbed me." I remember pausing and asking, "Who stabbed you?" He shrugged. "Woman I kept in my basement." The room got dead quiet. At first we thought he was joking. People say insane stuff in county jail constantly just to get reactions. But Dennis never smiled, never changed expression. He just stood there calmly, staring past me. The sergeant overheard and immediately separated him for questioning. Over the next few hours, detectives interviewed him while we locked intake down. Apparently, Dennis described a basement in Tennessee in disturbing detail. Chains bolted into concrete, a mattress, a floor drain, even where he kept canned food. The creepiest part was how casual he sounded talking about it, like he was explaining how to fix a lawnmower. Around sunrise, one of the detectives came back looking pale as hell and quietly said, "They found the basement." Turns out there actually was a missing woman connected to the area he described. Later that morning, Dennis sat alone in holding, waiting for transport. Every time I walked past his cell, he'd just be sitting there staring at the floor, completely motionless. Eventually, I stopped and asked if he needed water. Instead, he looked up and asked, "You got kids?" I told him no. He nodded slowly like he was relieved. Then he said, "That's good. Girls stay scared longer." I still remember the feeling that gave me. Not fear, exactly. Just this horrible realization that I was talking to somebody completely empty inside. When transport officers finally came to move him, he resisted for the first time all night. Not violently. He just kept repeating, "You can't leave the lights on. She hates the lights." One deputy finally snapped and yelled, "Who?" Dennis looked confused for a second, then quietly said, "The girl downstairs." From what I heard later, he died in custody before the case ever went to trial. Heart attack, supposedly. The missing woman was never found. This happened in county jail back in 2017 while I was waiting to be transferred after getting locked up for a probation violation. I was only supposed to be there a couple weeks, but the jail was overcrowded, so they had people sleeping everywhere. Eventually, they moved me into a two-man cell with this older guy everyone called Raymond. First thing I noticed was how insane he acted around guards. The second they walked by, he'd start mumbling to himself, scratching at the walls, laughing randomly, talking about invisible people. He'd spit food on the floor and bark like a dog during med pass. Guards hated dealing with him, but the weird part was the second they left, he'd stop immediately. Completely normal, like flipping a switch. The first night we talked for hours. He sounded educated, honestly. Smart guy, calm voice. Told me he'd been in and out of prison most of his life. I finally asked him why he acted crazy. He smiled and said, "Crazy inmates get left alone." And honestly, he was right. Guards avoided him. Other inmates avoided him. Nobody bothered him for commissary or problems because they thought he was unstable. After a few days, though, I started realizing something was seriously wrong with him. Not mentally, personally. One night during lockdown, he asked me if I'd ever seen someone die before. I told him no. He nodded and goes, "It's quieter than people think." Then he just stared at the ceiling for like a full minute. Another time he asked what my mom looked like. Weird question, but I answered. He goes, "You should call her when you get out. People disappear fast." There was something about the way he said things that made my skin crawl, like he enjoyed making people uncomfortable. A week later, one of the guards came into our pod furious because somebody had beaten an older inmate badly in the shower overnight. Broken jaw, ribs, teeth missing. Nobody saw anything. But later that night, Raymond quietly asked me, "You know why they never catch people in jail?" I said no. He smiled without looking at me. "Because everybody's scared they're next." I barely slept after that. The part that really messed me up happened my last night there. We were locked in after count, and Raymond was sitting on the lower bunk, sharpening a toothbrush on the concrete floor. Not hiding it either, just scraping it slowly. I asked him what he was doing. He looked right at me and said, "Tomorrow they're moving me to another pod." Then he smiled a little, and I don't like introductions. I didn't say another word the rest of the night. Next morning, they transferred me out before breakfast. About a year later, I looked him up out of curiosity. Turns out Raymond wasn't crazy at all. He was serving time for stabbing his neighbor to death over a parking dispute. And while he was in county waiting for trial, another inmate in his pod got beaten nearly to death by someone they never identified.